Infanticide sounds like something only the darkest villains of history would do. But here is the uncomfortable truth. It was not the villains. It was everyone. Ancient Greeks did it. Ancient Romans did it. Prehistoric hunter-gatherers did it. Philosophers wrote about it calmly. Societies accepted it openly. The evidence keeps coming out of the ground. In the bones of newborns, archaeologists find in places that tell a very specific story. Most people assume ancient humans were just like us underneath. The evidence says, not quite. In 1988, in the ruins of a Roman-era bathhouse in Ashkelon, Israel, archaeologists found something that stopped the excavation cold. In a sewer drain beneath the bathhouse floor, they found the bones of nearly 100 newborns. The bones were mixed in with ordinary drain refuse, broken pottery, animal bones, scattered coins. The infants had not been buried. They had not been given any ritual. They had simply been disposed of. The bathhouse had been built in the 4th century of the Common Era and used until the 6th. DNA analysis of the remains showed a striking pattern. The overwhelming majority of the infants were male. Forensic anthropologist Patricia Smith of Hebrew University examined the remains. There was no sign of illness or disease. The infants had been healthy when they died. Her conclusion, published in the journal Biblical Archaeology Review and later in the Journal of Archaeological Science, was careful but unambiguous. The most likely explanation was infanticide, the deliberate ending of newborn lives, at a site that researchers believe may have also functioned as a brothel, which would explain why the unwanted infants were predominantly male, the offspring of sex workers with no means and no reason to raise them. Think about what that means. Archaeologist Ross Voss, who made the initial discovery, thought he had found chicken bones, small, fragile, scattered through the debris of a working drain. It took a laboratory to understand what he was actually looking at. Nearly 100 human beings, each no more than a week old, disposed of alongside broken pottery and animal waste. This was not a crime scene. This was a drain, and that is the part that is hardest to sit with. If you find this kind of buried history worth understanding, hit the like button right now. It helps this reach the people who need to think about it. To understand why this happened, you need to understand something about the world these people lived in. Ancient humans, whether prehistoric hunter-gatherers or residents of a Roman city, faced a set of constraints that most people alive today have never experienced and cannot fully imagine. Food was not guaranteed, shelter was precarious, medical care barely existed. Raising a child required years of resources that could mean the difference between a family surviving a bad winter or not. And there was no social safety net, no state support, no formula, no orphanage with reliable funding. If a family could not feed a child, the child died, either by the family's decision or by starvation, which was simply a slower version of the same outcome. This is the context in which infanticide existed, not as a sign of moral failure, as a survival calculation. Prehistoric evidence is harder to find, precisely because prehistoric people left no written records and their remains are far more scattered. But archaeologists have found patterns. Newborn skeletons buried separately from older individuals. Newborns without grave goods in cultures where even young children received them. Newborns in unusual locations. Pits, refuse areas, the edges of settlements, rather than formal burial grounds. The pattern is consistent enough that researchers have a working framework for identifying likely infanticide in the archaeological record. A newborn who died naturally would typically be buried with some care. A newborn found in a drain or a pit with no grave goods tells a different story. The written record is even more direct. The ancient Greeks discussed infanticide openly and without the moral weight we bring to the subject today. Plato, in the Republic, suggested that children born with physical defects should not be raised. Aristotle, in the Politics, went further, recommending that laws be passed to limit family size and that infanticide be the mechanism for enforcing those limits. He wrote about it the way a modern economist might write about tax policy, as a tool, as a solution to a problem. Sparta had a formalized system. Newborns were examined by a council of elders. Children deemed too weak or too small to become useful citizens were taken to a place called the Apothetai, a chasm on the slopes of Mount Taygetus, and left there. This was not hidden. It was law. It was the state deciding which children were worth the resources required to raise them. Rome was somewhat different. Roman law gave the paterfamilias, the male head of household, the power to recognize or reject a newborn child. A newborn placed on the ground after birth was being presented to the father. If he lifted the child, he accepted it into the family. If he did not, the child was exposed, left outside, where it might be found and taken in by someone else, or might not be. Roman writers describe this practice without evident distress. It was a legal right. It was exercised regularly. The Ashkelon bathhouse drain is not an anomaly. It is one data point in a consistent pattern that runs across the ancient world. Here is where the story gets more complicated and more human. Not all ancient infanticide was the same. Researchers distinguish between populations and circumstances. Hunter-gatherer societies practiced what anthropologists call birth spacing, a pattern in which a mother could not effectively care for two non-walking children simultaneously. If a second child was born before the first could walk independently, the survival of both children was genuinely at risk. Under those conditions, the decision about which child to prioritize was not a sign of cruelty. It was a recognition of biological reality. Most people, when they first encounter this, assume it was about indifference, that ancient parents simply did not love their children the way we do. That is almost certainly wrong. Anthropologist Sarah Ardy, who has studied maternal behavior across cultures and species, has argued that infanticide in foraging societies should be understood as part of a broader system of parental investment. Resources devoted to a child who is unlikely to survive, or who would compromise the survival of existing children, can reduce the overall reproductive success of the family. In that framework, the decision to end a newborn's life was, in a specific and brutal sense, a decision about which lives could be sustained. This does not make it comfortable. It is not meant to, but it changes what the behavior means. These were not people who did not love their children. The archaeological and anthropological record shows abundant evidence of deep parental attachment in ancient societies. Elaborate child burials, grave goods placed with young children, evidence of care for children with significant disabilities. The people who practiced infanticide were the same people who mourned their children deeply. The two things existed together, in a world where resources were finite, and the margin between survival and death was very narrow. Sex selection complicates the picture further. The Ashkelon finding, mostly male infants, runs counter to what many people might expect. In many historical societies, female infanticide was more common because sons were seen as more economically valuable. In ancient China and India, the preference for sons was extensively documented. Rome and Greece were more mixed. The specific circumstances of each family, economic pressure, the sex and apparent health of the child, the number of existing children, all influenced the calculation. What the evidence shows is not a single practice with a single motivation. It shows a range of responses to one fundamental problem: more children than resources could support. It was not random, it was calculated. So, when did this change? The shift was gradual and uneven. Christianity played a significant role in the Western world. Early Christian writers condemned infanticide explicitly, and as Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, legal and social pressure against the practice increased. The Emperor Valentinian formally outlawed infanticide in the Roman Empire in the year 374 of the Common Era. But law and practice are different things. Infanticide continued in various forms well into the medieval period, often disguised as accidental suffocation or abandonment. The Foundling Hospital, designed to receive abandoned infants anonymously, emerged partly as a response to that reality. The deeper shift came with changes in the underlying conditions. As food security improved, as child mortality from disease declined, as social support structures developed, the calculation changed. The practice did not end because humans became more moral. It became less common because the conditions that had made it logical became less common. What does this tell us about ancient humans and about ourselves? It tells us that human beings are extraordinarily adaptive. The same species that painted the cave walls at Lascaux, that buried their dead with flowers, that cared for individuals with severe disabilities. That same species made pragmatic decisions about which newborns to raise. Both of these things are true simultaneously. Neither cancels the other out. It tells us that moral frameworks are not fixed. The Greeks who read Aristotle's Politics were not morally inferior to us. They operated within different constraints and different assumptions about what obligations parents owed to newborns not yet formally incorporated into the family. The line between a newborn and a person with full moral status was drawn differently in most of the ancient world than it is today, and it tells us that the evidence in the ground is honest in ways that written history sometimes is not. The Ashkelon drain does not tell us what Romans thought they should do. It tells us what they actually did. The bones in the Ashkelon drain sat in a laboratory for years before anyone fully understood what they were. Fragile, intact, nearly 100 of them, a newborn, no older than a week, disposed of alongside the ordinary refuse of daily life. That drain was not built to hold a secret. It was just a drain. The secret was that what happened there was not a secret at all. It was ordinary. It was human. It was what people did when the world gave them no other option. A prehistoric mother, a child she cannot feed, a decision made before language had words for it, before law had opinions about it. In that gap between instinct and survival, ancient humans were doing what humans have always done, calculating what was possible, choosing what could live, and leaving in the ground the evidence that we have only recently learned to read.